a private foundation headquartered in Denver, Colorado, dedicated to achieving health equity for all Coloradans. I'm associate professor of family medicine at the medical school and of epidemiology in the School of Public Health. And I did chair the task force from 2004 to 2011, and I just realized it's been a decade now. So I certainly hope my comments are still relevant today. Thanks.
All right, Alan.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me as an outsider to this field. So I am unemployed. I, however, used to work. I do spend a lot of time on boards and committees, mostly for the National Academy Complex and for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I did have a job. My last job was the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the executive publisher of Science and the other science journals. I also spent 13 years at NIH, both as director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse and as the deputy director and acting director of the National Institute of Mental Health. Ned noticed that it's a decade since he left the task force, and I have to say it's almost double that since I left NIH. So we'll see if my perspective is still valid. Good.
All right. That's terrific. So Ned, we've asked you to reflect on a taxonomy, on research gaps more generally. What wisdom can you share with us?
Sure, thanks, Tracy. I'm sorry I have to begin my comments. I'm going to concentrate mainly on screening, but I think these translate to other services as well. And something I haven't heard, I just want to bring up the value that I heard first from the original task force, back when we still numbered them, in terms of screening, that it's hard to improve on asymptomatic. So we're talking about intervening in OWAPs, right? Otherwise, well, asymptomatic people. And when we do this, we need to do it based on compelling evidence. And I think an I needs to be an acceptable conclusion. We're not working in the setting of a patient with symptoms where we have to do something. And in that setting, an I or not taking an action isn't really an option. And then I always ask folks to remember there are potential harms associated with screening in terms of the ramifications of false positives, false negatives, overdiagnosis, the diversion of resources to ineffective services, and harms from the test itself. So sorry, that's my disclaimer and preamble. I didn't hear a lot about harms in the previous discussions, and so it's always my church at the skunk picnic, no, skunk at the church picnic job to bring that up. I agree with the committee and the direction of this study that taxonomy would be helpful for researchers and research sponsors in addressing the research gaps inherent in the I's. I also think the type of gap can be matched to the research approach needed to address it. I also noticed that Sue did this, and I want to remind people there are 2 additional letter grades other than an A and B that an I can move towards. One is a C, or at least moderate certainty that the net benefit is small, and a D, at least moderate certainty that the net benefit is 0 or net harm. I listened to David, who I thought did a good job of outlining the different kinds of I's. I group them into 4 major categories I would think you'd want to consider in a taxonomy. One is a break in the evidence chain and the analytic framework that Michael really talked about. The second is uncertainty regarding the magnitude of the benefit and the magnitude of harms. The third is a lack of evidence in subgroups. And the fourth is a lack of evidence regarding starting and stopping ages, periodicity, and different screening modalities. I think the other things I've heard in talking with Tracy in preparation are issues and gaps in terms of dissemination, implementation, and performance in different contexts. And I'm glad Amy is here because I think these research gaps are critical and are clearly addressed when possible by the community guide. Not that both groups shouldn't do it, I just kind of, being chair of the community guide, have seen those issues brought up often around screening or prevention procedures found to be an A or a B by the USPSTF. So if we talk about the most common breaks in evidence, they're both related to whether early detection actually leads to improvements in health outcomes. The break could occur between screening and what we call important health outcomes, such as mortality. They can be between screening and an intermediate outcome, such as a lower cancer stage, or they can be between an intermediate outcome and an important health outcome. And I would suggest that the research design required to address these gaps will always aspire to be the randomized controlled trial. I think there's a possibility that a well-done quasi-experimental design and maybe pragmatic trials, although I start worry about allocation bias, but these might provide adequate evidence. I would have concerns about using observational studies in these gaps. And then as I think about who would pick these up, I think the research sponsor or sponsors need to match the actual screening topic. So when I think about the institutes, which institute would that topic fit under? There's a couple of examples of moving an I to a B. So recently, type 2 diabetes. In 2008, we gave blood glucose screening an I for normotensive adults. And then there were 6 new trials. And the 2015 update resulted in a B recommendation for overweight and obese adults. I also was asked to think of an example where we didn't come off the I. And so I think there the example I would give is glaucoma screening. There was a randomized control of screening that found reduction in small visual cuts, which we listed as an intermediate outcome. But there was insufficient evidence that these small deficits otherwise impaired vision. So those are examples of how to move off of an I or not off of an I, depending on additional research. And I have to note that both of these topics are in review today for updating. So what about research gaps regarding the magnitude of benefits? I think this happens more in the area of a small to modest benefit that we find in a number of studies, small number of studies, I'm sorry, or inconsistent results that David talked about. An example here might be mammography for breast cancer screening in women 40 to 49. The first published results from the Swedish 2-county study actually noted a non-significant increase in mortality with screening, which changed to a non-significant decrease at the follow-up analysis years later. Depending on how you count them, there are now 6 randomized controlled trials of screening in this age group, none of which has statistically significant results. And the 2008 Oregon EPC meta-analysis resulted in actually the first statistically significant result for that age group. Here we also took another look at harms and turned to observational data from the Breast Cancer Surveillance Consortium data set. And the EPC used observational data to identify the magnitude of harms. And the task force had a long dialogue about the suitability of observational data in terms of looking at harms, and decided this was a relevant use of those data. And with those 2 estimates, we were comfortable moving this recommendation from to a C rather than the alternative I. So there are a couple of other issues. Often these issues occur when the benefit is small, close to the null. And I was intrigued by Dr. Atkins' suggestion at some point we should say that for these small benefits, depending on the condition, maybe this would be a good place to not pursue any farther. The other issue to remember is that we still underestimate harms. And in considering evidence gaps, we have to raise up a valid estimate of harm, and that should have equal attention as do the benefits. And then the last area, I have subgroups, ages, periodicity, and different modalities. And I thought Dr. Atkins covered these pretty well. The challenge of significant participation in screening trials from subgroups, I think, will continue to be difficult to address with RCTs. Here I suggest we need to consider other tools at our disposal. We could start with post hoc analysis of available trials and then consider combining these with modeling based on the prevalence of the target condition. An example would be the increased incidence rate of prostate cancer in African American males. We've already used modeling to address periodicity, starting and stopping in different modalities. Here, I think the best example is colorectal cancer screening. So that's how I look at the taxonomy. I think I've heard a lot of dialogue about getting additional detail. And then I would really urge the committee to think about what are the relevant available research approaches for each gap, not ever losing sight of the fact that we're dealing with otherwise asymptomatic people. So thanks, Tracy.
Great, thank you so much for summing up in that really helpful way, Nat. Let's look to Alan next, and after that we can have more of a conversation. So, Alan. And so, Alan, take yourself off mute.
You missed the best part of my talk. Thank you for including me. I did join from the beginning of the discussion, and it was very informative. I am a generalist who is not an expert in prevention. I actually had never seen that taxonomy before. I had never heard of that taxonomy. But once I started to think about it, and I was asked to speak from the perspective of what I would call a non-expert funder, somebody who is asked to devote resources to prevention research. And however, I do have to say, I left NIH a long time ago, although I have stayed involved in lots of different funding things. I was on the National Science Board for 12 years. But I am struck and therefore feel some disclaimer is required, and therefore I will confess that I am violating a lifelong rule that I've operated under called never discuss floods with NOAA in the audience. And I apologize to all of you for doing that. So let me say that I've also always felt prevention research is among the most difficult from any perspective, and it's certainly more so in some domains than in others. The difficulties in the domains I've worked in, most often mental health and substance abuse, often come from imprecision in our understanding of the etiology of the illnesses or the causal links between risk factors and the indication, and then difficulties in modifying protective factors or behaviors on a large scale. And then, of course, the imprecision in the effects of interventions on selected outcomes. So I think that the first panel this morning did provide a great amount of insight into the perspective of a funder, again, not necessarily a non-expert funder, and I'd like to contribute that. But I particularly refer you back to Hal Sox's 12th slide this morning, which listed the criteria for priorities, I thought very clearly and simply. Let me also say that I think what you're doing is incredibly important. We need to have a way to classify the strength or depth of our understanding about causal factors for health outcomes and what we can do about them. But we need to have a way to talk about it in English. And I was struck by Sue Curry's comment at the end of the last panel, where she made mention of the potential utility of this kind of a taxonomy for others other than people directly related to the task force or to people who work in prevention. You need to have a sense of just how good, how strong various kinds of interventions or approaches are. Certainly from the perspective of a non-expert funder, I've always believed it's an important principle that you lose large parts of the audience when you drop into jargon or acronyms or codes that are hard to keep straight. And I did have trouble keeping straight the nuances. So if there's a way to convert to English as opposed to letter grades, I think that might be a useful service to provide. So let's go back to the issue of funders for just a minute. So recognizing where I come from as a non-expert, looking at the statement of task, there are two broad types of funders that you need to attend to and that need to be influenced or brought into a partnership. And the tactics used by research advocates need to be quite different. One is obviously the experts in prevention, who we heard from earlier today, and they typically in NIH talk are program officers or branch chiefs, maybe even division directors. But then the people who set the overall priorities are institute leaderships, and they're the people who need to understand what you're talking about and understand some sense of just how credible these interventions are, and therefore need to be persuaded of the utility of investing in this kind of research. So I would argue that the approach with each class of funders needs to be quite different, but I can say as a principle based on my own experience, it's very important to understand who before whom you stand. That's actually a phrase in every synagogue in the United States. Know before whom you stand. Don't try to force non-experts into the framework or taxonomy unless they really need to do it. It's much more effective to speak English. A second complication is that not all prevention outcomes are similar, and therefore, as you look at the taxonomy, if there's a way to create more of a matrix kind of approach that in fact reflects the dissimilarities among the kinds of outcomes or targets, that might be very helpful. So for some indications, when the risk or protective factors are well understood and linear or straightforward, there's much more intuitive confidence that prevention interventions can be effective than when the set of risk factors have more generalized or broader array of outcomes. So the domains I know best, as I said, are mental health or mental illness and drug abuse and addiction. And most of the risk and protective factors are the same as those for everything else bad that can happen to you. So drug abuse, juvenile delinquency, poor school performance, mood disorders, they all share a set of risk factors. And then on the other hand, manipulating those risk or even the protective factors is extremely difficult. Now, from the perspective of, for example, an institute director, it's great, of course, if you invest in one kind of test of an intervention, and then it doesn't work on your indication, but it does work in some other area that's a sort of, for you, a side effect. That's gravy, but you have to be able to convince the funder that in fact the things they're responsible for have a chance of being influenced. I would, however, say that in the taxonomy that you're working from, it does seem to be oriented around the effects on the specific outcome. And that's very helpful. And I try to stick with that as much as possible. In talking about evidence gaps, especially for specific outcomes and the gaps that can tie specific risk or protective factors in their designing interventions will be very useful. I think it's very important to be as specific as possible in identifying research gaps when trying to move forward. This is true in any research area. Of course, it's not unique to prevention. But again, in my experience, there's always the danger of being too broad, not specific enough, and that the data that are brought to bear are not directed enough. So Tracy was kind enough to send us the slides that Dr. Klabunde from NIH used in your last workshop. And I wanted to say that the list of common evidence gaps that were used by Dr. Klabunde, or that's depicted in that slide show is particularly important conceptually, and it made it immediately obvious to me, a generalist, of what in fact he was talking about, and then how one would respond. And just to remind you, the common evidence gaps were high quality RCTs, randomized clinical trials, long-term effects on morbidity or mortality, effects stratified by baseline risk or subpopulations, and then effects of intervention, components, and evidence of harms. So if you can keep those kinds of gaps identified, I think that would be very useful itself. That's it.
Thank you both for really nicely summing up a lot of what you've heard this morning, and for adding your own perspectives and experience into it. I'm going to again take the prerogative of floating the first question, and then look to our committee members to chime in with additional questions. I think that as we think about the terms in a taxonomy, what I'm actually picturing is that these are attributes of a particular kind of research that could be initiated to fill an evidence gap that may need to be weighted in some way. So, for example, do we consider the fact that this addresses a vulnerable subgroup, or an age group for which there is not very much evidence, as being more important than a particular rigorous design, such as a randomized trial? Is feasibility, to what extent does feasibility weigh against the need for a particular kind of evidence? And so I guess that I'm looking at Ned and Alan and asking, from a task force and then from a funder's perspective, is this actually more about prioritization and weighting of what types of studies would be the highest priority, would have the most impact in terms of moving a field from an area of insufficient evidence or uncertainty to more clarity? A letter recommendation would be great, or at least more clarity about how to practice. Should we be attempting to create a taxonomy that supports that type of weighting or prioritization?
Ned, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Alan. I think that's really right on. The task force does have a prioritization approach. Usually it's aimed at, we're going to select a new topic. And I think of prioritizing the research gaps to answer for existing insufficient evidence within a positive or a conclusion of a positive topic, is a strategy that will help kind of think about what's going to move us farther forward in terms of addressing issues that we're most interested in. So if we're most interested in subgroup analysis, and I think I'm really pleased to see equity lifted up by this group, by the national academies, and by the task force and the community guide. I think that this
looking at vulnerable subgroups or subgroups with differential either participation in services or differing epidemiology of disease conditions. I think prioritizing those issues is a really legitimate approach to thinking about how do we want to move our existing topics forward to provide better coverage, better equity, and move our whole primary care population and citizens forward in terms of achieving optimal health. And I think we often look at the new strategy or the new innovative screening on the scene and get excited about that and say, oh yeah, we've got to look at CT colonography because it's new and innovative and exciting. And it might have less
importance to the overall promotion of preventive services and better health overall, it might not have the same comparison to, again, thinking about something like prostate cancer screening in African American males, or what do we do with triple negative breast cancer approaches in African American women. So I think or the differential health outcomes that we know are associated with pregnancy in both Latinx and Latinas and the African American population. So I think this prioritization idea really has a lot of merit in terms of where she would put our resources first.
You know, it's interesting, Ned. I think that you interpreted my comment or question even more broadly. I was actually kind of reflecting on Sarah Beth Broder-Fingert's observation that it would have helped the researchers within a particular domain to have, you know, some sense of the weight of the different types of studies that they could do in terms of impact on a task force statement. I think you actually are thinking even more broadly to across different topics within the portfolio, which is also valid, I would say.
So I took that the same way. That is, for me, the most important thing, obviously, is going to be impact. But I think, and I agree with everything that Ned said, so I won't repeat it, but I would add to it, one of the problems that I encountered with prevention research was that often there was a tendency to look at small incremental changes that might have a minor incremental effect on the outcome and sort of get hung up in that continuation. And I think from a funder's point of view, particularly if you have to invest a lot of money, you want to be assured that you're either going to get a transformational result, you know, which will change the strategy. But again, as Ned said, you don't want to jump on everything that's novel. Or something that has the potential to hit a group that ought to be a priority. So for example, again, as you've said, anything that could touch on disparities that have been ignored for so many years has to have a somewhat high priority because it's urgent and needs to be dealt with as soon as possible.
I guess the other, just to circle back around to, I think, what you were trying to ask is that, yeah, I think within a topic or within evidence gaps in a certain area, that's what I was trying to get at with the breaks in the evidence chain. Where can we make sure that the evidence that we're promoting, we prioritize, it has the best chance of getting us over the gap? So I would not do another glaucoma screening trial that looked at small visual deficits. I would say, what is the natural history of someone with small natural deficits over time? Do they go on to have significant visual impairment that we know that preventing the small deficits would do? So it really gets back to where is the gap in evidence chain, and prioritize the study that will best link that gap.
And really both levels, including the broader one that you observed, are of interest. I'm going to look at our committee members and actually go to Nico first, and then I'll look to see if anyone's waving on video. So Nico, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for these presentations. There's another terrific set of panels today. My question has to do with sort of the taxonomy context. And so we've heard today that, you know, the utility perspective is probably important, you know, for whom, and if this is going to be for funders, for researchers, for task forces, for different audiences. It's going to be this perspective that needs to come into play: mortality, morbidity, other issues. At the same time, we want to make sure that we keep things real, keep things in English. So in the past, we've also heard that simplicity is going to be important. But with more and more of these components that are important comes less and less simplicity, if you will. So if we, or as we are pursuing this taxonomy question, what does simple to you look like from a perspective of, in your view, what would a simple taxonomy look like that can be appropriate for these different audiences?
It's a very good question. Alan, do you want to take that one first, and then we'll look at Ned?
Well, I was just going to say, a part of it, I think a decision has to be made, and perhaps your committee can help with that. For whom is the taxonomy, right? I mean, it's very much from the earlier conversations today, I'll have to say, it sounded like the taxonomy is really for prevention people at the most general, but for prevention researchers, rather than for the entire public health community or for the entire research community to try to make sort of prioritization decisions. I think as simple as you can keep it, the better. But that doesn't mean that if there aren't sort of subheadings, that they shouldn't be applied. So there's no reason this couldn't take outline form, right? You get the first label is fabulous, and under fabulous you have 3 qualifications, and then the second heading is meh, and then below that, but my point is it's really important. I can't tell you how many times I've been beaten to death by jargon, and when Tracy first asked me if I considered doing this, I had no idea what an I statement was. And then I had to, figure it out. And the truth is, I've been working around public health issues for 30 years. I know I look much younger, thank you. But it nonetheless, you shouldn't have to get a translator in order to figure it out. And then having said that, if you do it in an orderly way, I think it would be very useful.
To your jargon question, Alan, I've often said on my headstone, I want it to say evidence of no benefit is not the same as no evidence of benefit. And then let people scratch their heads as they read that.
I get it.
The other thing I'd like to say, so I think simplicity, as you said, Nico, is key. And I really like Alan's suggestion of thinking about a matrix. So he talked about subheadings, but as he said that, I automatically started putting the simple kind of main categories for the taxonomy across the top, and the subheadings or other more detailed issues down in the rest of the matrix. And Alan, I thought that was really insightful, because I could see, between Atkins and me and my presentation, I would hope that you would find what are the major issues, the major topics, the major categories of evidence gaps, and then the detail you could fill out in the rest of the matrix. So I'll just come back to that idea, Alan, which I thought was elegant.
By the way, just before we go on, I was going to make a slide of it, but one of the disadvantages of being retired is I didn't have anybody help me. How do you make that on a PowerPoint slide? But I like that idea.
That's great. All right, let's look to Sue then.
Alan, I'll just give you a blanket offer. I have fun doing PowerPoint, so call me anytime and I'll help you. I'm also retired, so I have the time, sort of. I think this is just a great conversation. I shared some thoughts after the last open session on what a simple taxonomy would look like, because Nico asked me that question. I don't know if the committee's had that information or if it's appropriate to share. But I do think, going back to Alan's point and Ned's point, that if you look at the recommendation statements from the task force now, there's a narrative about research gaps. And I think that narrative is a good thing to have. It's written in English. But if it was followed by, I think I called it a table, Ned called it a matrix, where you have categories of types of research gaps, as the columns, and then the rows are filled in, based on what the narrative is, that could be incredibly important. Tracy, I think your point about prioritization and weighting is critically important. I do think that funders have to prioritize, researchers have to prioritize, and the task force is prioritizing all the time, from selecting topics on down. And I'm just going to keep going back to, I see the taxonomy as necessary but not sufficient for the kinds of conversations or interactions or communications, whatever you want to call them, that need to happen in order to move this kind of science forward. It's always beneficial. It doesn't always lead to a multi-site randomized trial when folks can sit down together and look at a common language and, again, maybe agree to disagree. So I don't think it's one group that's going to prioritize, and there will be times where the priorities will coalesce, and there'll be other times where they won't. And frankly, if NIH is prioritizing from a taxonomy that the task force understands and the research community understands, I think that's fabulous, even if it might be a different prioritization than the task force would give. But then when somebody asks, why aren't you filling this research gap, the answer is sort of a common conversation, rather than everybody pointing their fingers at everybody else saying, well, they're not telling us what to do and they're not telling us how to do it, and so forth.
Tracy, I was really glad that Sue brought up the research gaps, because I know when I was leaving the task force, I think the last few years we provided the entire list of research gaps to somebody at NIH, and I don't know who the somebody was, and I think the ACA helped firm that up a little. And I know Tracy Wolf's on the call. I'm not quite sure of the process now, but there is part of me that always dreamed of this conference at the beginning of the year, where that list of research gaps was discussed with potential funding agencies that would include ARC and CMS and NIH and CDC. And I'm sure there are other, oh, I'm sorry, Corey, I did not mean to leave Corey out, but that really engaged in a real dialogue that would help both sides prioritize what that list may look like. I was always looking about a way to translate those gaps into research opportunities and funding. And at least in my time on the task force, we never got there. And I think this committee is actually looking at ways to achieve what we had hoped to do with that entire list of research gaps. And so I would just offer that. I'm thinking about solutions before you get to the complete identification of the issue. I would always think about how to make that dialogue happen in a real, in an earnest, authentic, back and forth dialogue that would help both sides be clear on what would move the prevention field forward.
So let me just make it just a hair more complicated, because there are different categories or kinds of research gaps that you could be worrying about. So you can worry, again, if you're a funder responsible for mental health, or you're responsible for heart disease, right? Then you have more substantive kinds of research gaps. But there may also be some cross-cutting, what you might think of as either enterprise research gaps, where methodologies need to be changed and methodologies need to be thought about, or specific tools and infrastructure has to be built. Astronomers can't do anything without the most expensive toys in the world. Are there things in these general domain that are research or infrastructure or cottage cheese, call it what you want, but are there things that funders ought to be supporting that could help make even bigger changes, transformational or quantum leaps in the the mental health business, the ability to look into the brain of living, breathing, awake, behaving individuals with imaging has made a tremendous transformation in our understanding of mental illness, in our thinking about it, et cetera. Are there things in prevention that ought to be included in a category of research gaps?
Yeah, Ellen, I think you're pointing out an opportunity for this committee to observe whether there are cross-cutting types of gaps that we should point out in the process of making our formulating our thinking and making our report and recommendations. So that's very, very helpful. I see that we are nearly at the end of the hour. So I'm going to take one last look at the committee members and to any task force members in the audience and to see if you are waving your hand or have any remaining comments or questions. I'm going to ask the committee members to stay for just about 5 minutes between the close of the session and the end of the hour, if we have it, and then Kathleen and I will kind of give you a heads up on next steps. So, all right. I would like to thank our last pair of speakers, Ned and Alan. It was so good of you to join us and to kind of help us sum up from your broad perspectives in the roles that you now have and from the great experience that both of you have. So thank you so much for being with us. Kathleen, can we close the open session and invite the committee members into a break room? Is that possible?
I don't know how to do that. That's a question for Alexis.
That's a question for Alexis.
We're going to try, I think.
Okay. We may not.
You just wanted to close this meeting to the public.
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, you can. All you need to do is to dismiss.
I'm going to stop recording.
Yeah.